Hi everyone, this is Carly Hassefeld for our Logic of Inquiry class. This week I read the book Other, Please Specify Queer Methods in Sociology, and we'll be talking specifically about chapter 6 and 7. The first chapter we'll talk about, chapter 6, is entitled Not Out in the Field Studying Privacy and Disclosure as an Invisible Trans Man, written by Casey Hughes. In this chapter, Hughes talks about several different topics. The first topic is entitled Becoming Stealth, Hiding Your Identity from Colleagues and Participants. For Hughes specifically, he was studying and doing research with participants who were associated with a religious organization. He knew that there could be dire ramifications had he come out to his participants as a trans man due to the judgment that he would receive. It could have ended his study altogether, made his research participants uncomfortable and unwilling to participate, and skew the data in the way that his participants would answer his questions. Hughes also talks about the parallel processes of coercive institutional disclosure. This is where there might be a power dynamic between a sociologist and their participants that is similar to the power dynamic between a government agency and a person receiving benefits from a program. The questions being posed by a member of the government are probably still deeply personal to the participant, and their answers are determine the outcome on whether or not they receive benefits from a program altogether. So, how can a sociologist disassociate themselves from a government agency and provide the participants with the benefits before they start the interview? So, in order to try and lessen the power dynamic between a researcher and the participant. One way of shifting this power dynamic is revealing personal information about yourself to your research participants in a way or an attempt of building trust with them. But in revealing personal information, this can come at a price for both the researcher's personal comfort as well as the data that they collect. There are prospects in talking openly with one another, but sometimes talking openly can come at a price. I would like to expand upon why Hughes is inspired to study privacy and disclosure with participants. To quote, because of my personal history, I was acutely aware of how such questioning on the part of authority can feel demeaning or disrespectful, especially when questions are personal. So, how can a researcher make their participant more comfortable? One method that I thought was important is that Hughes suggested provide compensation before you even start to interview the participant. This way, the participant can understand that if a question makes them uncomfortable, they can stop at any time, leave the study, and still receive the benefit and the thanks of having contributed their knowledge and experience in the first place. Hughes then talks about how some researchers try and level the playing field with their participants by revealing their own personal information and history to make the participant more comfortable and understood. This cannot always be achieved depending on the circumstances of who the researcher aims to interview. For instance, Hughes talks about how being a trans man, he knew that he could not disclose that information to his participants out of fear of being discriminated against by them or their unwillingness to continue in the research altogether. But this can come at a personal price for the researcher because since they have not disclosed their personal history information with their participants might be more candid about a topic that can make the researcher uncomfortable and upset. So, what are some of the aspirations after reading this chapter? For me, I would like to be open with participants when I can and when it's appropriate for the conversation, but I understand that being open with a participant can come with ramifications if they do not agree with my life choices. Another thing that I thought was interesting is that you should provide the participant with the incentive first and show of good faith and appreciation for their time and willingness in the first place. Another thing that's important for me to keep in mind is that there can be emotional consequences when conducting research related to personal history and topics. And to keep in mind to try and remain analytically objective when I don't agree with the participants that I'm interviewing. But to contrast that idea, I want to end on a quote. Black feminist thinkers have long argued that there can be real danger in leaving the self out, both for the researcher and for the richness of the work itself, which can be true for queer people and other people who are marginalized identities. So, moving on to chapter 7, entitled Thank You for Coming Out Today, The Queer Discomforts in In-Depth Interviewing, written by Catherine Connell. In this chapter, we cover turning a queer lens on a research method as a way of illustrating the productive tensions that may emerge. Then there's presentation in the field. How does a researcher identify themselves to their colleagues and participants? And in what ways can that identification signal kinship and acceptance of who you are interviewing? However, it's important to note that Connell touches on the fact that by identifying and signaling kinship and acceptance towards your participants, assumptions can form and shape the data gathering process. Lastly, it talks, can an interview change a life? And how sometimes there are unintended outcomes from interviewing participants. By making them visit and go in depth on topics that affect their lives, you start to create a thinking process for them that can either change their viewpoint on a certain issue or inspire them to make change in their life. So I want to expand on the presentation in the field topic. To quote, while this no doubt did promote rapport and perhaps a sense of intimacy for some of my participants, it also had the unintended consequences of limiting what they were willing to say and shape how they said it. In my effort to gain their trust in the project and myself, I rushed to assure them that I already did understand, which limited my ability to have them explain themselves to me. Since some sociologists might try and identify with their participants to make them more comfortable when talking about sensitive issues, there are pitfalls in inaccurately representing oneself just to fit in with the participant. For instance, Connell talked about the fact that she had identified herself as a fellow gay teacher when in fact she had only taught at a collegiate level and her participants were teaching in the younger youth levels of 1st through 2nd grade, and had a basic understanding of what actually working in public education is like for a gay teacher. But her participants might have assumed that she really did understand what they were going through and might not have had the chance to expand or explain themselves on their experience. I can understand why a researcher would want to try and identify with their participants to make them more comfortable. And what's important to note is that queer theory conceptualized discomfort as a productive tool for challenging the status quo and inciting social change. And Connell would argue that the same is true for queer methods. By getting into the root of that discomfort, we start to realize maybe the trends of what is happening and lead to better theories and conceptualizations of the hypothesis and what is happening. What I liked about this is Connell had embraced the messiness of bringing up hard emotions and those personal biases of how the topic might influence the researcher as well as the participant. So to quote, I had forgotten to queer my research. This is easy to do given the disciplining power of traditional methods, which urge us to take ourselves, our identities, our policies, our feelings out of the research process and to avoid confusion and ambiguity in all costs. In contrast, a queer methodology can retain the effective dimension of the research process and all the messiness it may contain. I do support that we should try and grapple and understand the messiness rather than ignore it because it can lead to those deeper questions and hypotheses. Creating those discomforts and maybe as perceived as failures is how we learn and our opportunities to evade the limitations of academic traditional methods. So now I want to ask myself is how can I embrace the messiness of being personally related to the topics that I am studying, embrace it, find those difficult conversations for people I disagree with, and move forward and learn different methods of research that can lead to deeper questions and a hypothesis. To end this on a quote, while I do believe it's important to be attuned to ways you can continually improve your research approach, I am encouraged by these reminders that the pursuit of queer research is not the resolution of ambivalence, contradiction, or failure in the field, but rather the recognition to tolerate the uncertainty and the vulnerability, the pleasures and the pains of the work, and to keep asking, keep thinking, keep writing, keep fighting in the face of it. Thank you for listening to my presentation, and I look forward to talking with all of you on Monday night.